Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh, and in today's episode of Sticker Shock, we're going to be taking a look at three very high-end headphones, and I have the honor of being able to compare them. So here are my thoughts on the Abyss Diana 5, the V2, and the Hifiman HE1000se. We're going to start with build. The build have two different methodologies that result in two different conclusions. One is going to be the build between the Phi and the V2, which is identical except for three things. That's going to be your color options, the substrate material, and the trace material. That is the only three differences between the Phi and the V2. An overall look into this build is it is incredibly well built. More of an industrial build, more of a very tough, rigid, super strong materials. And the HE1000 is more of a luxurious build. Now it's actually one of the better built Hifimans that are out there. It does use a pretty liberal use of metal, and it's overall a more comfortable headphone than the Dianas are. It is a little bit heavier. The Dianas are fairly lightweight, though the HE1000 is not a super heavy headphone. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is the differences in amplification requirements for all of these. Now the HE1000 was sort of designed from the ground up to be a very efficient large planar. You can legitimately run this thing off of a phone or a laptop straight out of the onboard audio. And because of how well tuned this thing is, it's going to sound fantastic even out of those. Now it is going to benefit from amps, but it's certainly not an amp dependent planar. The same cannot be said for the V2 and the Phi. Both of these are very amp dependent. The Phi is a little bit more amp dependent, it's a little bit pickier, but both are very hard to drive. You're gonna want quite a bit of juice for both of them. Now on a personal note, when it comes to lower price headphones like under $1,000, you know, a lot of people aren't gonna wanna spend an extra $100 to $500 to get a really good amplifier for their headphones, even if they're spending that much. You kind of have to have one type of person already to buy an expensive headphone like that, but then you have to have an entirely different type of person to buy an expensive headphone and to buy a high-end amplifier. However, I think the people who are focused at this price range are already owners of amplifiers or are willing to spend a little bit more to get a very good experience. The amplifiers that I've used with this are many, but the standouts are the iFi IDSD Pro. I use the WA11 on it, the WA22. I did use the WA33 on the Phi and the HE1000se, but I didn't get the chance to use it on the V2. I've also used a myriad of lower end gear like THX amps, like 789s, 887s, the THX DAC amp for monoprice, and lately I've also been really enjoying the Shit Magnus. So a lot of amps on these. There really isn't any particular thing that I like better. They're all just a little bit different. So the tube amps give things a little bit warmer of a sound signature. All of these headphones play well with that, but they also all play well with the super analytical approach of some of the solid states. So regarding which amplifiers are good and which amplifiers are bad, pretty much the common trait between the Dianas is the more power, the better. And the HE1000, you can really throw at anything and it's gonna sound pretty good. Though I will say this, between all three, the Phi is notably more dependent on the amplifier, and it will show you the biggest differences between the amplifiers. It's good with all of them, but you definitely notice the differences when you switch. So before we talk about sound, I do want to talk about my personal biases here. Now, already, right off the bat, I can tell you that I prefer the V2. It is the most balanced sound to my ear between all three of these. It's got a good mix of clarity and warmth, and it sounds the most pleasing to me. So this is my personal favorite. However, the Phi is very good in some other areas, differing from what the V2 is good at, and the HE1000 has the same thing. It's good in its own areas, differing from the Phi and the V2. So what's my preference may not be yours, and my goal here is to draw the lines of where things are good, where things are bad, and then you can make up your own mind as to what fits you the best. So I said in the V2 review that the treble response was just about perfect, and I personally think that it is. I think it hits dead center exactly the way I like it. It's very detailed, like even in the realm of hyper detailed, super detailed, whatever you want to call it, but it's not super forward. So it's got this balancing act of information, but it also isn't overcommitted towards forwardness or overcommitted towards being too warm or too dark. So it hits exactly dead center for me as to preference. So let's consider that the baseline. The Fi is more detailed, but it's a little bit more forward also, especially in the upper treble. So it's a little bit less enjoyable for me personally, even though it is more information. And that's, let's say if 5 is the baseline, the Fi is like a 6. Now the HE1000 is even more detailed, but it's quite a bit more forward. And I think a large reason as to why it is more detailed is because it is more forward. Now it's actually quite a bit more forward than the V2. So the V2 is a 5, Fi is a 6. The HE1000 is more like an 8. It is notably up there in terms of treble forwardness. Now this is impressive for what it's able to do, but for enjoyability, for me, it kind of misses the mark a little bit. So as impressive as it is for information gathering, I don't really find myself wanting to do it. Now for mid-range response, all three of these really trade blows. They are all amazing in their own ways. There is one problem with the HE1000 that has to do with treble response, and that's going to be the S or T range. It's a little bit sharp and a hair sibilant in that area. Well, not really sibilant, it's just very forward in that area, and it can come across as unpleasant. So you have a pretty good fulfilled vocal range for the HE1000 in most of the areas, but it just can't finish it with a perfect S region. Now the S region is not a problem on the V2 and the Fi. Now the Fi has what I would consider to be very clean, very clear vocals, but the V2 has a little bit more added warmth and a little bit bigger, fuller body to the vocals. The vocals on the V2 are a big reason as to why I like this headphone, so between the three, they're obviously my favorite. However, from a technical perspective, I think the Fi is perhaps a little bit more complete, and I do like the presentation the most on the HE1000. And that mostly has to do with the impressive sound staging capabilities and the layering capabilities of that headphone. So I don't really like the vocals from a frequency perspective as much as the V2 and the Fi, but I do like them from a presentation perspective. Now another thing here, and something that we'll talk a little bit more in depth in a second, is going to be the tonality of things. The tonality of the Fi and the V2 are very similar. The V2, again, being a little bit warmer, but those feel very correct to me. They've always had this sense of correctness that I talk about in the Diana Fi review. Now the HE1000 to me seems a little bit thinner, a little bit tinnier, a little bit less filled out, and not exactly correct. It's good, it's just not as perfect as the V2 and the Fi, which seem to stand out above most other headphones in general. Now I want to talk about the comparisons between the types of information that you can get from all these headphones, because they are all very detailed headphones. These are headphones that you can use for personal enjoyment, but if you need to analyze something, all of these can do it to a degree that that may make you see things in a different light. Now, one of the things about the Diana Fi that people at least that I and the people I've talked to have to acclimate to, is the type of information and the delivery of said information that you get with this. This is a headphone that is probably going to immediately sound a little bit strange, and it's not like most other headphones. And what I've nailed down as to what that sense of strangeness comes from is an immense amount of room information and reflection information. Not reflections caused by the headphones, but reflections that are actually built into the music. And the resolving capability of this driver is able to display that information in a technically impressive but sometimes distracting manner. So to be a little bit more specific as to what I'm talking about here, if there is a voice in a room, like this room right here, right? I will listen to this recording on a V2. It's not a perfectly acoustically treated room, so there's a little bit of liveliness, a little bit of reflection in that comes through on the V2 and on the HE1000se. But listening to this on the Fi, it sounds terrible because It is so good at picking up that reflective information in a way that I have not heard any other headphone do. But what this effectively does for your listening experience is that anything that wasn't recorded to absolute perfection, you are going to see or hear the environment that it was recorded in, and it's going to be very obvious. Now, this is notably different than something like Soundstage. Soundstage and the HE1000, which is soundstaging, is something this is very, very good at. What this headphone will do will show you the placement of a sound in any given space. So if it's, over there, it's going to show you over there. If it's right up close, it's going to seem right up close. The Fi will show you the space itself. And that's the differences between these two. The placement of things is sort of like a lot of you are probably familiar with the HE1000s. Those are a very placement specific headphone, and those show you the placement of sounds in a given space. The Fi is very different from that. It's very different from most other headphones. It's not always good though. It's impressive always, but it's not always good. Now this is where the V2 lags behind a little bit. It doesn't outclass either of those headphones in any of their respective categories. So the Fi is better with room information, and the HE1000 is better with sound staging and placement information. Now the bass response between all of these, they're all fairly good, but the quantity goes to the HE1000 by quite a large margin. So if you like bass and you don't want to have to EQ, I think the HE1000 is going to be the way to go for you. Though you do have to deal with that kind of sharp top end, and it's a little bit more V-shaped in comparison to the Fi and the V2. Once I EQ the Fi and the V2 up to match kind of the level of the HE1000, they all seem to be just about equivalent for tonality, for quality, and for quantity, but you do have to EQ to them to get there. So the bass performance in all three of these headphones for this comparison are all good, but the HE1000 is definitely a bit stronger. So this leads me into music recommendations for all of these. Due to the sound staging capability, the top end forwardness, the impressive bass response, I think the HE1000 is much better suited for large scale music. Why do I say that? Well, for vocal music, the proximity effect of those S's seems to be a little bit of a problem. The top end information for really intimate recordings can often be a little bit too forward, but the sound staging and placement capability and detail capability, it makes for some of the best reproductions of large scale recordings that I've ever heard. Simply put, it's stellar for things like Blade Runner soundtrack, the Arrival soundtrack, the New Tenet soundtrack, things of that nature, songs like that. I don't think it really gets much better than the HE1000se. Vocal-based music, I would actually prefer the V2 over most other things. Maybe not for individual songs, but I think as an overall category. Now this makes up the majority of what I personally listen to. Well, I would say it's a mix between like soundtrack type stuff and vocal-based recordings. But either way, if you're listening to a lot of vocal-based things, that is going to benefit the V2 more than the other headphones. The Fi is something that if you want to have the purest audiophile listening experience with like the purest audiophile recordings through the craziest amps, that's going to be your headphone. That's going to be like the sit down and just go balls to the wall overkill for like 2 hours. That's going to be the type of music and the type of listener that I would recommend the Fi be used for. Though it's notable, all of these, like I'm only comparing them, right? So all of these, if you were to take them individually, are just hyper impressive headphones. They are so far above most other things in the market, and they are legitimately among the best headphones on the planet. So when I say X, Y, or Z is better, don't take it personally. These are all very, very, very good headphones, and they'll deserve your attention. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for this comparison. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And until the next video, my name is Josh, signing off.